This is an abandoned town that vanished the moment Stalin died. But what happened here, and why was it completely deserted? In 1953, Joseph Stalin, who had been the dictator of the Soviet Union for over 3 decades, finally kicked the bucket. He'd ruled the USSR since 1924 when he took over after Lenin, and during his time in power, he'd done some pretty horrific stuff. But in one particular city, there was absolutely no sorrow whatsoever. You see, Stalin had been a firm believer in hard labor, and he believed that if the Soviet people weren't working, they were being unproductive members of society. So he'd built special towns where those deemed as undesirable could work until their dying day. So they weren't even allowed to have a toothbrush or a change of clothing. And when they heard that he'd finally kicked the bucket, they were more than happy to abandon their homes and leave. Most of them only had one wooden hut that they shared with hundreds of other prisoners, and that was only ever locked at night. In fact, most of the people who lived in Dalstroy were born under his regime, so they knew nothing else. As a result, many of them had never even heard of another way of life. Many of them had been in the settlement since they were children, and they knew nothing else. After all, she hadn't had a day off in over 15 years. But while other teachers rejoiced and began planning their futures, Mrs. R found herself unable to move on. You see, she'd always been obedient and followed the rules. And now that she was free, she was unsure what to do next. It was like a bird that had been caged its whole life and was now suddenly set free. 5. She'd come to the town with her husband, who was a miner. He traveled to the area and found a man named Mikhail, who had been sent to Dalstroy in 1949. He was now in his 70s and ran a small plot of land near the abandoned town. We just saw that he was dead and went about our business. They'd been living in fear for so long that it was difficult for them to adjust to a world without Stalin. He found old foundations, pieces of machinery and rusty tools, all of which showed the harsh reality of life in the settlement. Even the ones who were happy to leave Dalstroy didn't want to reminisce about their time there. Some of them probably even mourned his death, but it's impossible to know because they never spoke about it. But he never forgot that while he'd been working at Dalstroy, he'd stolen food from the prisoners and taken it to his family. He figured that if he'd been in Felice's position, he wouldn't have been able to stand up against the system, especially considering it had conditioned him to be a mindless worker bee for over 30 years. But when the day came that he gave the order to shoot a woman, he broke down and quit. He admitted that he worked there between 1949 and 1954, and that he oversaw the executions of countless prisoners. But he claimed that he was only following orders, and that he couldn't control his actions. He said he was given no choice but to obey and carry out the horrible tasks, or he too would be imprisoned. And she spent most of her days educating young children about subjects such as math, reading, and writing. However, as you can imagine, it was very difficult to teach when your students were malnourished and exhausted, and she often felt terrible for them. Over the years, the buildings were demolished, and the town no longer exists. Today, if you visit the site, you'll find nothing but trees. For example, there were doctors who'd been sent to Dalstroy for treating patients who had contracted syphilis. There were also people who were punished for stealing grain. You see, Stalin believed that the USSR was on the verge of starvation. So anyone who was caught hoarding food was given a harsh sentence in one of these labor camps. But Stalin had ruled with an iron fist, and, as a result, fear had become a part of everyday life. And in it, he wrote about the hopeless situation he and the others were in. He described how the prisoners' hands would bleed while working, which would then become infected and turn into gangrene. Then the guards would simply cut off their fingers, which they could then use to make soup. Can you believe it? So much so that when he was gone, people were still afraid to speak their minds. And so when Stalin died, they really didn't know what to do with themselves. By day, they were forced to work until the sun went down. During the Great Purge, he'd overseen the execution or imprisonment of millions of people who he suspected were a threat to his power, or were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. So let us take a look at this ghost town and find out why its residents were so happy about Stalin's death. The name literally translates into "of the construction" in Russian, and it would eventually become home to around 70,000 people. This was essentially the removal of Stalin's statues, renaming of places, and most importantly, the release of political prisoners. And this was music to the ears of the people living in Dalstroy. Finally, they could leave and start a new life. At the time, the Soviet government was trying to industrialize the country as quickly as possible. And they were doing this by building factories, roads, mines, railroads, and massive canals. Of course, this required a ton of cheap labor. And so they began sending people to Dalstroy under false pretenses. It was a brutal time to be alive. His father had already been sent there 5 years earlier on claims that he was an enemy of the state. But in reality, he'd merely complained about not getting enough food. When Solomon arrived, he was thrown into a labor camp where he was forced to work long hours extracting gold, diamonds, and other precious minerals from the tough terrain. If you didn't work hard enough, then you were considered a poor performer. And this meant you got even less food and your hours were increased. Pretty messed up, right? And when Stalin died suddenly of a suspected stroke on March 5, 1953, there was very little mourning throughout the country. One of these cities was called Dalstroy, which was located deep in the northeast of the Soviet Union and today sits within the borders of Russia. It all started back in 1931 when Stalin ordered the creation of a new settlement that would come to be known as Dalstroy. For example, in 1937, 18-year-old Solomon Krymer moved to Dalstroy with his mother from Latvia. On top of this, prisoners were forbidden from keeping anything personal with them. So it's clear to see why the people who lived in places like Dalstroy hated Stalin. But as we mentioned, Stalin had ruled the USSR since 1924, and that's a very long time. After his death, Nikita Khrushchev became the leader of the USSR, and one of his first acts was to introduce the concept of de-Stalinization. Between 1953 and 1956, almost all of the residents left Dalstroy. But it wasn't easy for them to just pick up and go. For instance, there was a school teacher named Raisa, who we'll refer to as Mrs. R. for our video, who taught at Dalstroy School No. It wasn't until Stalin died that she felt hope for the future once again. She recalled, "I was glad that Stalin was no longer alive, but that's about it. There was no joy, no hilarity." As you might have guessed, many of the town's residents felt the exact same. For the people of Dalstroy, Stalin's death didn't bring happiness, but rather a sense of uncertainty. But anyway, as time went on, the remaining residents finally left the town. However, in 2008, filmmaker Dmitry Vesyokin decided to honor the ghost town and create a documentary about it. Mikhail explained that the people who'd lived there had been from all walks of life. Incredibly, Mikhail had managed to keep a diary throughout his time at Dalstroy. After reading this, it's clear to see why the locals were so happy when Stalin died. Anyway, after speaking with the old man, the filmmaker decided to search for the remnants of the town. But perhaps the saddest thing was that none of the locals wanted to talk about their experiences. One of the few people who did agree to talk was a former guard named Felix. To his surprise, the filmmaker actually believed him. Although what he'd done was unforgivable, the filmmaker admired his bravery. The filmmaker wrapped up his documentary by saying, "Stalinism was a tragedy, not only for the victims, but also for the executioners. Everyone lost their humanity." It's hard to disagree with this statement. But what do you think happened to the people who lived in Dalstroy? Let us know in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.